Hello and welcome to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. So I realise that we're ready. By the time this video goes out, we are 4 months into the year. I wanted to reflect on some of my reading from last year, so I thought I would do a worst and best books I read in 2020. I want to end on a positive note, so I thought I would start with the top 5 or bottom 5 worst books and then do the top books. So let's get started. So at number 5, so this is the 5th worst book I read in 2020, and it is The Templars by Dan Jones. The subtitle is The Rise and Spectacular Fall of God's Holy Warriors. It's kind of a shame in a way that I've put it in my worst books of 2020. The reason I did is, I suppose I'm not really interested in the topic. I thought that I was. I thought that I would find the history of the Templars quite fascinating. And Dan Jones is an excellent historian. He's a very gifted writer. But as I read this book, I thought, this actually doesn't really interest me. It's a lot of battles, a lot of territory that is lost and then reclaimed and then lost. And all the while, I'm just sitting there thinking, why are these people there? Why are these people from mostly Western Europe? Why have they set themselves up in this part of the Middle East? They have no real business being there. Anyway, it's obviously a complicated topic, but it's just the whole topic didn't gel with me. If you are interested or think you might be interested in the subject of the Templars, as I thought I might be, then this might be the book for you. I guess if you want to read a history of the Templars, then what better book to read than this? It just wasn't for me. In at number 4 is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Lee, why are you putting this in your worst book? This is a really important book. This teaches very important ideas at a very particular time when learning about these ideas is more essential than it's ever been. And I completely accept that. These are important ideas. But the thing is, I read a lot of books, and in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, I made a concerted effort, as did many booktubers, to diversify my reading and to educate myself about topics that I had not spent a lot of time reading up on, and I felt quite ashamed about that. So I put a lot of books on hold with my library to learn more about the history of racism and colonialism and contemporary ideas about race that I was only kind of vaguely aware of through, I guess, articles or podcasts. So I'd never really sat down and read at least a sufficient number of books to get to grips with these histories and these ideas in the way that I did from July last year onwards. Robin DiAngelo's books was one of these books that I read. The others I read were Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, Brit by Afua Hirsch, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, The Autobiography of Malcolm X by Malcolm X, Wide Sargasso Sea by Rhys, Natives by Akala, Tuai, A Traveller in Two Worlds by Alison Jones, and Kuni Jenkins, Walking with the Wind, A Memoir of the Movement by John Lewis, Black and British by David Olusoga, The Fire is Upon Us by Nicholas Buccola, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House by Audre Lorde, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. So when people say, do the reading, I'd like to say that I have at least attempted to do the reading. I've certainly done as much of the reading as I can since I became aware of the fact that I need to do the reading. And White Fragility is only one of the books out of all of those that I've just listed that I read during that time. And I'm afraid to say that it is the weakest of all of those books. In my view, the reason why is because this is a book written for white people. It is self-consciously a book written for white people. But I find that concept really narcissistic, that the supposed answer to addressing racism is for white people to focus more on themselves. Yes, of course, we all need to reflect on our biases, on our place in the world, but a book for white people written by a white woman, yes, Robin DiAngelo is a white woman, telling white people to think more about themselves, I find the concept problematic. That is a simplistic reading of what this book is doing, I admit. But if I'm trying to learn more about my place in the world, to learn more about the privileged position that I hold, what helps me is learning about the history, about the events that preceded me being here, that led to the conditions that we are now experiencing. A lot of the books that I listed just now are books that look at history, the history of colonialism and imperialism, the history of racism and civil rights. And there's a lot of that history that I didn't know, and I'm willing to bet there's a lot of that history that you don't know, and I think that we only have a limited amount of time that we can spend reading and learning. And I just feel that it's far more valuable spending that time learning about this history to inform our thinking about our current circumstances than it is to read a book that tells us that as white people we need to think more about our whiteness and to reflect more on that guilt and what the white guilt means. And I guess I'm just a little frustrated that of all the books I've just talked about, it is Robin DiAngelo's book, a book by a white woman, which has sold so many copies and was on the New York Times bestseller list for so long. I think there are so many other books that can provide so much more value in the limited amount of time that we have to devote to reading books than White Fragility does. I worry that white people are reading this book to help them alleviate the guilt and terror they feel around racism, because they want to believe that they're good people and they want some reassurance that if indeed they are racist in a way that they don't intend to be, in a way that there's nothing they can do about it, that it's like some kind of original sin that they can continuously try to atone for but never entirely overcome, that is a kind of a religious overtone to the way the argument is presented. And I think it doesn't deliver the kind of value that histories of these topics can do as well. Which isn't to say there's no history in White Fragility. There is some history in White Fragility, but if you want to learn more about, say, the history of racism in America, which this book deals with in part, I highly recommend Michelle Alexander's book. I highly recommend John Lewis's book. I highly recommend Ibram X. Kendi's book, Start From the Beginning. I haven't read his more recent one. Don't start with White Fragility, is all I'm saying. The third worst book I read in 2020 is The Tragedy of Mariam, and this is by Elizabeth Cary. Elizabeth Cary was a poet and a playwright from the 17th century. She lived in 17th century England, and The Tragedy of Mariam is, my facts might not be entirely correct here, but I think it is the first play written by a woman that was published. Anyway, it is a very rare example of a published play that was written by a woman, so it has a lot of significance in that sense. But this is not a particularly interesting read. I can't imagine that it'd be particularly interesting to see performed either. Shakespeare it is not, although is that a fair comparison? I don't know. There's some interesting textual analysis you could do of this in terms of if you know about Elizabeth Cary's life and the fact that I think she left her husband, so there are some interesting aspects of her own life that you could map onto this. Although I guess that might be a bit of a stretch because you don't want to read too much of an author's life into their own work because you don't really know where the influences lie. But yeah, this wasn't a particularly interesting read. Okay, number 2, the second worst book that I read in 2020, and that was Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. It's almost as if I can sort of judge what are the worst books I read last year by just the amount of time it took me to read them. Admittedly, Skeleton Crew is quite a chunky book. I did listen to this on Audible, and it did take me, I think it took me maybe 2 months, maybe more than 2 months to get through this. Admittedly, I think the reason I didn't enjoy Skeleton Crew so much was I had read a lot of Stephen King in the run-up to this. I had set myself this goal of reading all of Stephen King's works in chronological order. So by this point, when I got to Skeleton Crew, I had read over 20 Stephen King books in the preceding 18 months. And I think I was kind of burning out in a sense. But yeah, Skeleton Crew. So this is a collection of short stories. And as always with the Stephen King short stories, I guess as with any short story collection, some are better than others. There wasn't really one that really stood out for me in this collection. Still, my favourite Stephen King short story collection is his first, which is called Night Shift. There's a lot of really pulpy horror in that, and I really enjoyed reading Night Shift. But with this one, I don't know. I think part of the reason is, I think I've said this in a previous video, I really struggle with a fiction on Audible, so listening to fiction in audio format, but I really struggled to get through Skeleton Crew, and yeah, maybe it's just I just read too much Stephen King by that point. It was after I read Skeleton Crew that I kind of stopped on this Stephen King marathon. I'm kind of now thinking maybe I might pick it up again in the near future because it is the next book on the list, and I have read it, but I'm looking forward to rereading it. So we'll see, but yeah, I just didn't enjoy Skeleton Crew. There are many other Stephen King books that I did enjoy. This was not one of them. And in first place, as far as, the worst books, the very worst book I read in 2020 was Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Briggs. I realize this is a really popular book. There was a film made by Tim Burton as well of this, an adaptation. I was actually really excited to read it because it is a very popular, young adult fantasy book. Because it's set in Wales, and I'm from Wales originally. But I just didn't think it was doing anything really interesting. I found it kind of predictable. I thought the main character was really not very interesting. I didn't really connect with him and his experiences. I thought that Briggs's portrayal of Wales was really shallow. I didn't get any sense that this was set in Wales in particular. It could have been set anywhere, frankly. Maybe that was the literary device he was going for, that it kind of is a nowhere kind of place. But then why set it in Wales? Why make these references to Wales? That was really odd. I did do a video where I talked about a bunch of books I read around this time. I also read a book about the Gower, which is a peninsula in Wales near Swansea. And it was all these oral histories from people who lived in the Gower, sort of from the late 19th century through to the kind of mid to late 20th century. And as a book set in Wales, if you like, that was far more compelling, reading these oral histories of ordinary people, than it was reading a fictional work set in Wales with fantastic events that was really quite dull. Not to mention the relationship between the main character and there's a girl at the orphanage that he ends up at, and there's a relationship between them that is just kind of all kinds of wrong, I found. I suppose one of the reasons why this was the worst book for me was because I had fairly high expectations. I thought this was going to be a really fascinating page turner, but in the end I thought it was dull and predictable, and why did he set it in Wales? Okay, so those are the worst books I read last year, but let's get on to the good stuff. What are the top 5 books I read in 2020? So in 5th place is a book that I've done an entire video about reviewing, and I'll put a link to that up there if you want to watch that video, and this is Let the Right One In. I'm not going to try and pronounce the author's name. I did try and do that in the video, but I'm sure I'll pronounce it wrong, so I won't do that again. Let the Right One In is a brilliant horror novel. It is by far the best work of contemporary fiction that I read in 2020. It is one of the best horror novels, if not the best horror novel I have ever read. So I was just talking about how Miss Peregrine's, could have been set anywhere, even though it was supposedly set in an island off the coast of Wales. This book has a real sense of place. This particular area in Sweden, there's this housing estate. It's grim, people are isolated, it's kind of fairly neglected. That place is essential to why this book works. It is in its sense a character of its own, in the same way that the hotel in The Shining is a character of its own. It's crucial to this book. And the characters are so fascinating. Even the ones that are peripheral in a way are all fascinating. Many of them are they're vulnerable, or they're isolated, they're mentally ill, they're being bullied, they're ostracized in some way, they are society's outcasts, and they all have roles to play in this drama that unfolds. That has a kind of a love story at the center of it. I can't say enough good things about this book, and the film adaptation, I've seen the original Swedish adaptation of this, which is also excellent, and I hear that the American remake is pretty good as well. I think very similar to the original adaptation. So the 5th best book I read in 2020 is Let the Right One In. Really good book. In at number 4, the 4th best book I read in 2020 is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. The Five is about Jack the Ripper's victims. And the emphasis here is very much on the victims as opposed to Jack the Ripper. There are so many books that have been written about Jack the Ripper. To my knowledge, there has never been a book written that is entirely about the women who that person murdered. And these are the 5 women that we can be reasonably sure were murdered by the same person at that point in time. The amount of research that Hallie Rubenhold conducts to piece together the lives of these women is remarkable. I'm in awe of what she uncovered in order to tell these stories. And she tells these stories in a way that is as good as any historical fiction you will read. These were real lives. And these are women that, for the most part, were at their lowest point when they were preyed upon by this individual. It's a real tragic mix of poverty and alcoholism and misogyny and neglect that leads them to the point in their lives where they are on the street and vulnerable, and sadly only remembered over the preceding century or more as prostitutes killed by Jack the Ripper. Their actual histories are far more complicated and far more interesting than the stereotype that we hear. And this is such a compelling read. I really recommend The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. In at number 3, and this is Walking with the Wind by John Lewis. John Lewis sadly passed away last year. He was a giant in the civil rights movement in America. He was one of the marchers who walked onto that bridge in Selma and was savagely beaten by the police. He was instrumental in the civil rights movement, and I knew very little about his story before I read this, and I'm very glad I read his own account of that story. I learned not only about his own life, but about many of these events that occurred and the way that they occurred in the late 1950s and through the 60s. To learn about these events in piecemeal is insufficient, at least for me anyway. To read in chronological order from the perspective of someone actually involved was an education for me. And not only that, but it's just brilliantly written, and it's so shocking, some of the things he experienced, some of the things he witnessed. As you're reading them, at first it's hard to believe that some of these things happened. But then, at the time I was reading this was shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And of course, it's not really hard to believe these things that happened. Again, I did an entire video about this book where I reviewed it. I'll put a card up there if you'd like to see that. But of all the books I read about the history of the civil rights movement and colonialism and imperialism, this is one of the best, one of the most educational, certainly in terms of the American perspective. This was vital. I highly recommend this one. Staying on that same theme, the second best book I read last year was Black and British by David Olusoga. And this is subtitled A Forgotten History because it is a forgotten history. Again, I did a whole video on this. It was quite a lengthy video where I talked about many of the aspects of this book that really stood out to me. There are two central points that Olusoga makes in this book. The first is that the history of Black Britons is not just a history of the migrations of people of Black ancestry to Britain and their settlement within Britain. This is about how the lives of Black people were affected by the actions of the British across the world, but particularly in Sierra Leone, where he spends a lot of time there, talking about the slave trade and the effects of the slave trade and the consequences of the slave trade. And the second point he makes is that the history of slavery in Britain, the way that it is talked about, there's far too much emphasis on the abolition of slavery and not enough on the damage and devastation wrought by that activity. What happened before slavery was abolished is just as important, if not really more important, than learning about how abolition came about. And there's very little of this history that I knew prior to reading this book, to my shame. This was not taught to me when I went to school in the UK. I've had to teach this to myself through reading this book. So just as John Lewis's book, I think, is essential learning for the civil rights movement in America, I think that David Olusoga's book is essential for understanding the history, Black history, in Britain and how the lives of Black people were affected over the centuries by the actions of the British. It's a big book, but a really important one. And finally, in first place, the best book that I read in 2020, and that is Pride and Prejudice. I had never read Pride and Prejudice before. I was supposed to read Pride and Prejudice when I was at university. I studied English literature. This was one of the set texts, and I didn't read it. I read some of it, but I didn't read all of it. And I just turned up to the seminar and kind of pretended to have read it. I know that's really bad. I regret not reading it then because this is just brilliant. And what was particularly enjoyable about this reading experience was I listened to this on Audible. And it was read by Rosamund Pike, the actress, and she does an amazing job voicing the various different characters. Just brilliant. It is just so funny and so surprising and so involving. I don't need to tell you how good Pride and Prejudice is. I mean, it's a classic for a reason. And I so wish that I had read this earlier in life, like when I was supposed to read it, but I'm so grateful that I read it now. I'll definitely be picking up more Jane Austen in the future, and more kind of classic works more generally. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you read any of these books, tell me what you thought. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. Tell me if you think I'm right. And don't forget to give this video a like, and please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye for now.